One thing that pleases me is the number of people who are here this morning. And somehow I feel surprised, as though I'd given birth without quite knowing that I was going to. But anyway, I'd like to welcome you all to the second annual conference of the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature. And hopefully we'll take up where we left off last year, both in terms of content and also, hopefully, in terms of tone. And so without bothering you with a lot of ponderous formalities, I'll turn the panel over to John Ferris, who will serve as moderator. John?
Thank you, Dave. I don't intend to indulge in ponderous formalities either. I think the best contribution a moderator can make is to get the hell out of the way as quickly as possible. So I will simply introduce the speakers to you in turn. The first speaker is Professor Alma Payne, who is known to most of you, I suspect. She is a professor of English and director of the Center for American Studies at Bowling Green. She asked me to be sure to describe it as the center, since it has just been designated as such. Alma, as you know, is a veteran of Midwest literary studies, is the author of articles on W.D. Howells, Clarence Darrow, B.O. Flower, and the Arena magazine. She is also currently doing a bibliography on Louisa May Alcott. She was on the panel last year when she talked about Howells and his Midwestern origins, as well as his later attitudes toward those origins. And today she's going to talk to us about the reactions of writers over the years, both attraction and repulsion, to the city of Chicago. Alma?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be included on the panel again this year, and I thought it was going to be all freewheeling when we had finally disposed of the problem of what is Midwestern literature. You notice I didn't say settled. I said disposed of the problem, until I suddenly looked at David's description, which said by major writers, and once again I was up the old tree. I have worked with Howells so long that I'm going to use the prerogative of the realist selectivity, and I beg you ahead of time to be tolerant of my selection of authors. You may not agree that they are all major, but they are mine own, and I would like to use them. Linda will, I'm sure, know what I mean when I say that I'm going to start with some lines from Carl Sandburg's Chicago in 1916, because it seems to me that it captures the theme which I would like to develop this morning. You remember some of the lines in Chicago: hog butcher for the world, stormy, husky, brawling, city of big shoulders, wicked, crooked, brutal. And yet, in a later line, come and show me another city with lifted heads, singing so proud to be alive, and coarse, and strong, and cunning. And as I looked at major writers and their focus upon the Midwest, one of the areas of interest seemed to be the city of Chicago. And it seemed to me that I could discern a dichotomous attitude toward that city, this very thing that Sandburg expresses, a slight repulsion because of coarseness and brutality, and yet a fascination because of the strength and the virility of the city itself. Probably the first period of major interest in Chicago was at the time of the Columbian Exposition in 1893, when Americans and foreigners flocked to the White City on the shores of Lake Michigan. And at least 3 major writers visited in that summer of 1893, among them Henry Adams, who spent 2 weeks there and came up with his usual lack of surety, but amazement at this product, as he said, of the Beaux-Arts artistically induced to pass the summer on the shore of Lake Michigan. And yet when he walked into the Hall of Dynamos, he saw that here in Chicago was the first hint of an expression of American thought as a new kind of unity, which of course was his quest. But all of this was just a stone's throw from Black Chicago, where corruption was an accepted way of life, where you have organized police and pickpocket rings as described in the Arena, and all of the other corruption. Perhaps less pessimistic was William Dean Howells, of course, who spent 5 days at Chicago in the summer of 1893 and recorded his reactions in 2 letters of an Altourian traveler, which he sent back to the Cosmopolitan, and which interestingly were never reprinted in his lifetime because they were too socialistic. Mr. Homos, his Altourian traveler, had expected Chicago to be, and I quote, a newer York, an ultimated Manhattan. But instead he found it was an Altourian miracle, quote, wrought here in the very heart of egoism 7 times heated in the fiery competition hitherto the sole joy of this strange people. Howells said only Chicago could have produced the White City because only Chicago had the vitality. And yet this dichotomy remained because the vitality was backed by the money from forces which did not have the spiritual beauty which the Altourian traveler saw in the buildings on the shore of Lake Michigan. A third writer who spent an entire summer in Chicago, you remember Hamlin Garland, who wrote home and told his father to sell the cook stove if there was no other way to get to Chicago, was ecstatic about the future of the artist in this Midwestern city. And out of his summer's experience came 2 of the essays which were later combined in Crumbling Idols, Local Color in the Novel and Local Color in Art. And for Garland, Chicago seemed to represent a new cultural center, out of which would rise the future artists born in the cities who would give utterance to, and I quote, the real utterance of the city. In part, at least, his idea was realized by a native of Chicago, who suddenly found that his own interest was aroused in his city, and this, of course, was Henry B. Fuller, who in 1893 produced the first of 2 novels which would deal with the Chicago scene. The first, The Cliff Dwellers, 1893. And while it has many weaknesses as a novel, for my purpose, it is quite effective. It presents so clearly, and better than had ever been done before, the financial Chicago society in all of its stratification in this Midwest that was supposed to be thoroughly democratic. And of course, it focused upon the skyscraper, which for the United States of that time was almost the trademark of the city of Chicago. But I have found Fuller's second novel, published in 1895, the best source of this divided attitude, because even the title can be taken in 2 ways, with the procession. Now, the procession can describe desirable social progress. After all, Mrs. Bates, who heads the procession in the novel, had seen the city when it was still a village, shortly after the Indian massacre, and had seen it rise to its position of eminence, which Jane Marshall, the heroine, perhaps wished to follow. At the same time, it seems to me this procession could be seen as a channel of conformity, which was wiping out the individualism of such a pioneer leader as David Marshall in the novel, whose physical decline parallels the ethical decline of the system which he had followed in his career. Whatever the interpretation of the novel, it is filled with excellent scenes of the streets of Chicago, of the shops, of the social events, of the mores, of the architecture, and Dreiser drew very heavily upon Fuller for the presentation of social classes in the Titan, where, of course, the struggle against society is central to the book itself. Any of you who have read Frank Norris's The Pit will always remember that monolithic Board of Trade building which mounts guard in the first chapter and the last chapter of the book, and in some way seems to symbolize the force of the city of Chicago itself. From the first chapter, where you have the double theme of the opera with all of its cultural potentials played against the corner in wheat, which is whispered behind the scenes, the reader is aware, I think, of a split, of a tension between materialism and between what one might speak of as cultural idealism. And Chicago itself tends to be split. It is centripetal and centrifugal. It pulls in men and railroads and wheat and just as rapidly casts them out again. And you have the contrasting patterns of fascination and repulsion. Curtis Jadwin, who is fascinated by the challenge of the corner on wheat, and young Cortell, the artist, who is repulsed by the gross materialism which he sees in Jadwin in everything that he owns and in his effect upon Laura. When you speak of an urban novel, and an urban Chicago novel, I think probably Theodore Dreiser stands as the high point. Because for Dreiser, Chicago had a very particular meaning. And I apologize for the rather purple prose in which he states it, but I think you can perhaps best realize what it meant to him if I quote him. In Dawn, he said, "The city of which I am now about to write never was on land or sea, or if it appears to have the outlines of reality, they are but shadow to the glory that was in my own mind. There was a mirror inside me which colored all it reflected. There was some mulch of chemistry," typical Dreiser, "that transmuted walls of yellow brick and streets of cedar block and horses and men into amethyst and gold and silver. The city of which I sing was not of land or sea or any time or place. I can scarcely find it in my own soul now." And this same awe, I'm sure, we recognize in Carrie as her train enters the outskirts of Chicago, or as she walks the streets in search of a job, or stands in the doorway looking out at the crowds. And just as the vision of urban life changes for Carrie in the course of the novel, so it did for Dreiser himself, and disillusionment came, so that it is through the eyes of Frank Cooperwood, particularly in The Titan, that we most clearly see the sense of an almost cosmic force in the city of Chicago, which in this case defeats him. But the fascination, I think, remained for Dreiser, because there's a passage from The Genius, and again it is quite purple. "The beat of 100,000 hammers, the ring of 1,000 trowels, long converging lines of telegraph poles, broad highways of tracks of railroads, people waiting at street corners, a spectacle of new, raw, necessary life. Here was the substance of a new world, substantial, fascinating, different." The sound of it looks back to Whitman and looks ahead to Sandburg, I think. But most importantly, that line, "new, raw, necessary life," seems to prophesy what had happened to the literary picture of Chicago by the 1930s. Because in the Studs-Lonergan trilogy, Dreiser's Chicago, in Farrell's prose, has narrowed down to the pool room, to the saloon, to the street corner of the white, Irish, Catholic, middle-class neighborhood of South Side Chicago. And the fascination of progress, the dream of progress, has completely reversed. And as you remember, for Studs, it is only the past that has any meaning, and the future has become meaningless. And finally, in the late 30s and late 40s, looking at the literary treatment of Chicago, one arrives at the nightmare ghetto Chicago of Wright and Motley. And in both Native Son and Knock on Any Door, the black author, in each case, sees Chicago as a crushing force, it was predicted early, which the hero, and you have to put it in quotes by this time, cannot hope to understand. A force which eventually sends Bigger Thomas and Nick Romano to death at the hands of a society which has moved very far from the Alturian dream of Howells or from the historian's hope for unity. It's become a place of alienation, of fragmentation, of impersonality, and of senseless death. And yet I hold that the fascination of the city, even in this negative aspect, remains for the American literary artist.
Thank you very much, Alma. Our next speaker is Blair Whitney, who is an assistant professor of American Thought and Language, who's going to speak to us on Vachel Lindsay and another utopian dream of the Midwest that went to smash. Blair has written a play on Vachel Lindsay, excerpts of which I've been privileged to hear. I tried to persuade him to stage a full-scale production of it to highlight the convivium this afternoon, but he modestly declined. He is presently doing a book for the Twain Company on John Neihardt, whom he tells me is the Poet Laureate of Nebraska. This morning he's going to speak to us about Vachel Lindsay. Blair?
Vachel Lindsay committed suicide by drinking a bottle of Lysol. One of several reasons for his suicide was that the world did not live up to his vision of it. Lindsay dreamed of turning his hometown of Springfield, Illinois into a utopia, and he devoted his entire life to preaching this gospel of beauty. The direct statements of Lindsay's gospel, which included a mild democratic socialism, municipal beautification, replacement of the mammon soul of avarice and business with a new spirit of beauty. Direct statements in such prose works as The Golden Book of Springfield and The Village Magazine are not very interesting. But when Lindsay's ideas are embodied in the characters in his poetry, the result is often first-rate. I call Lindsay a Midwestern utopia because he almost never left Springfield, either physically or spiritually. Instead of rebelling against his Midwestern background, as so many other Midwestern authors like Sinclair Lewis have done, Lindsay was proud of it. And from reading his poetry, we can put together a set of Midwestern ideals. These ideals do not constitute a specific logical program, but rather an attitude towards life, a way of seeing the world. As Professor Flanagan, who many of you know, has pointed out in a recent evaluation of Lindsay, he had a rich and colorful imagination, but almost no sense of logic. Stephen Graham, the English writer who accompanied Lindsay on a hiking trip through the Rockies, observed of his companion that he loves oratory more than reason and impulse more than thought. We Midwesterners are not all matter-of-fact, show-me people. Though Lindsay's ideals may be illusory, his poems are fine, specific expressions of what is still a genuine set of values in politics, religion, literature, and human relations. In politics, the greatest of all Midwesterners, of course, is Lincoln. And Lindsay, growing up only 3 blocks from Lincoln's home in Springfield, the Lindsay home is directly across from the governor's mansion, perhaps understood Lincoln better than any other poet. He created, in fact, a wonderful mythic Lincoln, the prairie lawyer, master of us all. In Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight, written during World War I, the poet imagines Lincoln taking the world's suffering upon himself. He cannot rest until a spirit dawn shall come, the shining hope of Europe free, the league of sober folk, the workers' earth, bringing long peace to cornland, alp, and sea. It breaks his heart that kings must murder still, that all his hours of travail here for men seem yet in vain, and who will bring white peace, that he may sleep upon his hill again. Another Lincoln-hearted man is John Peter Altgeld, the great liberal governor of Illinois, known as the Gray Eagle. After his death, Altgel's spirit lives on. Sleep softly, eagle forgotten, under the stone. Time has its way with you there, and the clay has its own. Sleep on, O brave-hearted, O wise man that kindled the flame. To live in mankind is far more than to live in a name. To live in mankind, far, far more than to live in a name. Another Lincoln-hearted man is William Jennings Bryan. I brag and chant of Bryan, 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 candidate for president who sketched a silver Zion, the one American poet who could sing outdoors. He brought in tides of wonder, of unprecedented splendor, wild roses from the plains that made hearts tender. All the funny circus silks of politics unfurled, Bartlett pears of romance that were honey at the core, and torchlights down the street to the end of the world. Bryan, however, loses. Election night at midnight, Boy Bryan's defeat. Defeat of Western silver, defeat of the wheat. Victory of letter files and plutocrats in miles, with dollar signs upon their coats, diamond watch chains on their vests, and spats on their feet. Victory of custodians, Plymouth Rock, and all that inbred landlord stock. Victory of the neat. Defeat of the aspen groves of Colorado valleys, the bluebells of the Rockies and bluebonnets of old Texas by the Pittsburgh alleys. Defeat of alfalfa and the Mariposa lily. Defeat of the Pacific and the long Mississippi. Defeat of the young by the old and silly. Lindsay even has a poetic reason for voting the socialist ticket. I am unjust, but I can strive for justice. My life's unkind, but I can vote for kindness. I, the unloving, say life should be lovely. I, that I'm blind, cry out against my blindness. Man is a curious brute, he pets his fancies, fighting mankind to win sweet luxury. So he will be, though law be clear as crystal, though all men plan to live in harmony. Come, let us vote against our human nature, crying to God in all the polling places to heal our sinfulness and make us sages with transfigured faces. Lindsay's parents were Campbellites, and his sister Olive was a missionary in China. So naturally, religion is an important part of Lindsay's values. You all know General Booth entered heaven. But Lindsay's noisy brand of Christianity is also expressed in his poems on Old Testament figures, notably in his famous poem on Daniel in the lion's den. King Darius said to the lions, "Bite Daniel, bite Daniel, bite him, bite him, bite him." Thus roared the lions, "We want Daniel, 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 we want Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." And Daniel did not frown, and Daniel did not cry. He kept on looking at the sky. And the Lord said to Gabriel, "Go chain the lions down, go chain the lions down, go chain the lions down, go chain the lions down." And Gabriel chained the lions, and Gabriel chained the lions, and Gabriel chained the lions. And Daniel got out of the den, and Daniel got out of the den, and Daniel got out of the den. And Darius said, "You're a Christian child." Darius said, "You're a Christian child." Darius said, "You're a Christian child." And gave him his job again, and gave him his job again, and gave him his job again. In literature, Lindsay admires those writers who have best expressed the spirit of the Midwest. His particular hero is Mark Twain, who is the subject of 3 poems. But who could dodge this genius of the stream, the Mississippi Valley's laughing dream? He is the artery that finds the sea, in this the land of slaves and boys still free. He is the river, and they, one and all, sail on his breast, and to each one call. Come, let us disgrace ourselves, knock the stuffed gods from their shelves, and cinders at the schoolhouse fling. Come, let us disgrace ourselves, and live on a raft with gray Mark Twain, and Huck and Jim, and the Duke and the King. One could go on, citing examples of Lindsay's ideals, but perhaps the best way to sum up is by quoting from his long poem, The Litany of Heroes, which covers all of human history. And it's a unique view of history, Lindsay's own. He starts out with the soul of China in history. Would we were scholars of Confucius' time, watching the feudal China crumbling down, frightening our master, shaking many a crowd, until he makes more firm the father sages, the soul of India in history. Would that by Hindu magic we became dark monks of Julid India long ago, sitting at Prince Siddhartha's feet to know the foolishness of gold and love and station, the classic spirit. Would that the joy of living came today, even as sculptured on Athena's shrine, in sunny conclave of serene design. The secular spirit in history. Nay, let us have the marble peace of Rome, recorded in the code Justinian, till pagan justice shelters man from man. Fanatics snarl like mongrel dogs. The code will build each custom like a Roman road. The world spirit of Islam. Would that on horses swifter than desire we rode behind Mohammed round the zones with swords unceasing, sowing fields of bones. The medieval spirit in history. Would that I might wake St. Francis in you all, brother of birds and trees, God's troubadour, blinded with weeping for the sad and poor. Religion in history. Would that such hills and cities round us sang, such visions of the actual earth and man, as kindled Titan when his life began. The Napoleonic ideal in history. Would that the cold, adventurous Corsican woke with new hope of glory, strong from sleep, instructed how to conquer and how to keep more justly. The eye of science in history. Would that the hot, dry wind called science came, forerunner of a higher mystic day. The American spirit in history. Would that I might rouse the Lincoln in you all, that which is gendered in the wilderness, from lonely prairies and God-tenderness. Imperial soul, star of a weedy stream, born where the ghosts of buffaloes still gleam. The conclusion of the ultimate and final heroes of this song, Wilson and Socrates. Yea, I would have you like stern Woodrow Wilson, drinking his cup as such proud men have done, since Amenophis forth addressed the sun, staking his last strength in his final fight, that cost him all to set the old world right. The League of Nations course is yet to run. The idol worshippers would end its fame, and cut from every wall its builder's name. Would we might drink with knowledge high and kind the hemlock cup of Socrates the king, knowing full well we know not anything, with full life done, bowing before the law, binding young thinkers' hearts with loyal awe, and fealty fixed as the ever-enduring sun. God help us live, seeking the highest light. God help us die aright.
Thank you very much, Blair. you and Rachel Lindsay constitute a pretty tough act to follow. I think that Paul Palazzo and Carl Sandburg, however, may be equal to the task. I see that we have put to rout our conference across the hall there. Their door is closed, ours is still open. Paul Palazzo is an assistant professor of American thought and language who wrote his dissertation on Whitman and has published articles on Whitman, Thoreau, and Emily Dickinson. He is currently doing a book for Twain on Emily Dickinson. I should mention, I suppose, that he's the vice president of the Michigan State University chapter of the American Studies Association, and he did not want me to leave out the fact that he is a co-editor and publisher and co-founder of the internationally celebrated Ghost Dance Press, which is headquartered here in beautiful downtown East Lansing. Paul?
Thank you, John. In 1946, the World Publishing Company brought out a book by Carl Sandburg entitled Poems of the Midwest. This was not a collection of new poems by Sandburg about the Midwest, but the joining together of two volumes previously published separately. Chicago Poems, brought out originally in 1916, and Cornhuskers in 1918. From the vantage point of a student of Midwestern literature, I think it is significant that a book with the title Poems of the Midwest should contain poems about one of the great crowded cities of the world, Chicago, and poems about one of the great empty natural places, the prairie. Because it seems to me that in the combination of these two physical and psychic entities, something can be learned about the meaning of the Midwestern experience for this Midwestern writer. The first poem of the Chicago Poems introduces with coarse rhythms and shocking images the brawny industrial complex where things are killed, made, and moved. Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling city of the big shoulders. The poet is fascinated by this city, drawn to it, proud of it, and also terrified by it because it is, as he says, fierce as a dog with tongue lapping for action, cunning as a savage pitted against the wilderness. On the other hand, there is the prairie, the opening poem of the Cornhuskers, and with easy flowing lyrical rhythms, the poet remembers his origin. I was born on the prairie, and the milk of its wheat, the red of its clover, the eyes of its women gave me a song and a slogan. And to contrast the violent, muscular existence of the city, Sandburg places the mystery of life and the reverence one feels for it on the prairie. Look at 6 eggs in a mockingbird's nest. Listen to 6 mockingbirds flinging follies of "Oh, be joyful" over the marshes and uplands. Look at songs hidden in eggs. To which one does this Midwestern writer cast his allegiance? To the city or to small towns on the prairie? Unlike many other Midwestern writers, Sandburg does not seem to have felt it necessary to choose one and deny the other. He lived with and within both, seeming to enjoy the sometimes contradictory emotional and psychic responses each created in him, and writing out of this conflicting vision some very good poems. He took from each whatever it offered him. From the city, excitement, culture, fame. From the prairie, refreshment, identity, the good life. The characters who people the Chicago Poems reveal the Midwest to be an international region. The Midwest as a microcosm, a melting pot, a representative sampling of the whole American experience. People of every nationality, race, and religion are represented here. An Italian ditch digger, for example, a Jewish fish crier, a German dynamiter, a black singer, Poles, Hungarians. And Sandburg accepts each with equal affection and appreciation. These immigrants are for Sandburg America's new frontiersmen, desperately poor, but full of life and energy, and willing to work hard in order to establish their dreams. In the city, Sandburg shares their suffering and their instinctive joy at being alive. In Cornhuskers, we meet different people, more comfortable Americans whose lives are tame and safe by comparison. A young girl, Nancy Hanks, who dreams about romance while sitting by the fire. Jimmy Wimbledon listening to early summer bullfrogs. And Johnny Jones wanting to see the Wild West show in town. These are the characters other Midwestern writers rejected or left behind because they were considered dull or uninteresting. But Sandburg cares about them, cherishes them for their peace and simplicity. In the urban poems, Sandburg is frequently enraged at social injustices, at maltreatment of the working classes, and artifices and corruption in our institutions. He rages with the fervor of a socialist, calling for an end to the abuse of mankind who have been victimized by the power of the wealthy. He sums up his philosophy of the common man in this poem. I am the people, the mob, the crowd, the mass. Do you know that all the great work of the world is done through me? When I, the people, learn to remember, when I, the people, use the lessons of yesterday, and no longer forget who robbed me last year, who played me for a fool, then there will be no speaker in all the world say the name the people with any fleck of a sneer in his voice, or any far-off smile of derision. The mob, the crowd, the mass will arrive then. In a number of poems, he attacks the industrial managerial complex, which saps the life out of working people to create vast profits the people themselves do not enjoy. In the poem, they will say, his target is child labor. In Mill Doors, he has a vision of workers being bled dry for the sake of pennies a day. In another poem, Sandburg buries the poor working girl, Anna Imrath, who died in a factory fire. And in Onion Days, Sandburg contrasts a poor Italian immigrant who slaves away 12 hours a day picking onions for 6 cents a box, while the owner of the farm sits in his Episcopalian church on Sunday, dreaming of ways to cut her wage by even more. Of the institutions which support the corrupt social systems, Sandburg is particularly incensed with the evangelical Christianity of Billy Sunday. With angry, strident lines into a contemporary bunk shooter, he assaults the insincere and unnecessary staging and gesturing which made Billy Sunday's preaching famous across the country. Sandburg accuses Sunday of being in league with the economic forces which suppress the people, and condemns the kind of Christianity he teaches, designed to keep the unhappy masses quiet and at their jobs, no matter how poorly paid they are. By contrast, the poems in the Cornhuskers section are suffused with the pleasantness of society in small towns and rural communities. The poet remembers with great fondness a baseball game between Chillicothe and Rock Island. He attends a band concert in a public square in Nebraska City. And in a poem called Village in Late Summer, he portrays a number of sleepy, quiet episodes in the lives of the villagers. These same kinds of activities of rural societies affected other Midwestern writers quite differently. Others felt oppressed and bored by life in their small towns and felt compelled to leave them in search of real life in large cities. But Sandburg sees in these small towns a gentle and humane environment. It leads him at one point to optimistically exclaim in a poem entitled Caboose Thoughts, "It's going to come out all right, do you know? The sun, the birds, the grass, they know. They get along, and we'll get along." This faith in the beneficial outcome of things stands in sharp contrast to the impatient, revolutionary tone of the urban poems. The subject of war, I think, is a good one for seeing the difference between what we might finally call Sandburg's urban vision and his rural vision. Within Chicago Poems is a section entitled War Poems, 1914 to 1915. And each of the 11 poems portrays some horror of war and the regrettable loss of life or issues that fade in importance when measured against the amount of blood spilled over them. In the poem Killers, Sandburg is haunted by the vision of men chosen for battle because they are young and strong. Under the sun are 16 million men chosen for shining teeth, sharp eyes, hard legs, and a running of young warm blood in their wrists. And a red juice runs on the green grass, and a red juice soaks the dark soil, and the 16 million are killing and killing and killing. In another poem, Sandburg watches colored buttons being moved back and forth on a war map, and is struck by the horror that a button, which is so easily moved an inch, is in sharp contrast to the fact represented, namely that 10,000 men and boys twist on their bodies in a red soak along a river edge, gasping of wounds, calling for water, some rattling death in their throats. Who would guess, Sandburg concludes, what it costs to move 2 buttons 1 inch on the war map here in front of the newspaper office? In another poem entitled Salvage, Sandburg converses with the Victorian poet and craftsman William Morris, and is glad that Morris is dead, so he cannot be horrified by the wartime destruction of the French cathedrals Morris so admired. In all of these poems, Sandburg is committed to life and beauty and to peace, and sees war as a senseless waste of all that is really precious and important. He is pessimistic, however, about men's efforts at solving their differences peacefully, and predicts with an eerie accuracy the kind of push-button annihilation, I think, that threatens all of us. He writes, "In the wars to come, silent wheels and whir of rods not yet dreamed out in the heads of men. In the wars to come, new silent deaths, new silent hurlers, not yet dreamed out in the heads of men. In the wars to come, kings kicked under the dust, and millions of men following great causes, not yet dreamed out in the heads of men." This vision of real war as a bloody horror I have called his urban vision, a vision which is reformist in attitude, apocalyptic in tone, and severely impatient with the stupidity and cruelty of men. His rural vision of war, on the other hand, is not soaked in blood, nor is it filled with the same urgency of emotion. Sandburg's rural vision is characterized by a mild complacency with the way things are, a strong sense of optimism, and a faith in the salutary powers of nature. Most of the war poems in Cornhuskers are set in the past, and the poet is recalling war after time and nature have healed war's wounds, buried the dead, and removed the fear and shock of battle. The poem entitled New Feet is typical of this attitude. Empty battlefields keep their phantoms. Grass crawls over old gun wheels, and a nodding Canada thistle flings a purple into the summer's southwest wind, wrapping a root in the rust of a bayonet, reaching a blossom in rust of shrapnel. Lovely nature here silences Sandburg's former wrath. In the long poem entitled The Four Brothers, Sandburg reverses his attitude toward war as expressed in the Chicago poems and replaces the themes of horror and waste with the theme of dulce et decorum est. He emphasizes the necessity and determination of France, Russia, Britain, and America in their righteous struggle against what he calls a half-cracked, one-armed child of the German kings. And in a fit of rustic patriotism, he shouts that God, who is the God of the four brothers only, is going to help us win this war. He concludes this poem with lyric optimism, looking forward to the day when all wars will end and the people of the world shall be safe. By way of a conclusion, I would like to state that I think one might consider the possibility of the urban-rural vision among other Midwestern writers. I think one might discover a conflict or a complement between the two, which may go far in helping us to understand how the Midwestern experience shapes the Midwestern imagination.
Thank you, Paul. Our final speaker this morning is Professor Ron Primo, who comes to us from Central Michigan University. Ron did his dissertation on the influence of Chaucer on Keats. One might wonder what he's doing at a Midwest Literary Conference, but he has developed an interest in black literature, he tells me, partly through Arnold Bontemps. His essay on the Harlem Renaissance appears in a book edited by Bontemps, along with an article on Richard Wright, and he teaches survey courses in black literature at the Central Michigan University. Today he's going to talk to us about Midwestern elements and influences in the works of black writers in the Midwest. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to speak before this group and the chance it affords me to try out some hypotheses that I'm working toward in an essay on this subject. There are many studies, regional type studies, of Afro-American literature in the South and in the East, especially, of course, associated with Harlem. However, the many Midwestern elements that seem to be quite evident in works by blacks go unnoticed. There is historical research on the distinctive qualities of black experiences in the Midwest to build on, however. Studying the problems of migration and settlement, Arnold Bontemps and Jack Conroy examine the lives of blacks in Midwestern small towns, as well as in Midtown and in urban ghettos, in any place but here. More recently, Philip Durham and Everett L. Jones reassessed the evidence of black cowboys to counterbalance the historical myths and legends of Western literature. And numerous biographies, such as Constance Webb's Richard Wright, and autobiographies such as Langston Hughes' The Big Sea, trace the impact of the Midwest on particular writers. And finally, many of the works of black writers are indebted to Midwestern culture or setting. This is a trend reflected in Robert E. Fleming's an annotated checklist of Afro-American novels in Chicago, which appeared in the Society newsletter last year, you probably recall. A closer look at a few representative works will help explain what this larger pattern is that I think has been overlooked and why it is important. I'll examine what the Midwest meant to Richard Wright in Black Boy, Native Son, and The Outsider, to Malcolm X in the autobiography, to Lorraine Hainsbury in Raisin in the Sun, and to Paul Laurence Dunbar and Gwendolyn Brooks, and a few contemporary black poets, Midwestern black poets. Black Boy is built on a series of sharp contrasts between Richard's imaginative awareness of his potential and at the same time is confronting day to day a life in a society that tells him what he must do and how he must do it. In the midst of these contrasts, the character of Richard develops as he sees Chicago as a symbol of everything inaccessible to him in the confines of the South. It might be possible, then, that what has traditionally been seen as Southern black longings for the North might be more specifically seen as a quest for Midwestern, rather than simply an undifferentiated Northern urban environment. I quote from Black Boy to give the flavor of the kind of quest which runs through the book. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown, to meet other situations that would perhaps elicit from me other responses. So in leaving, I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. Now, how the expectations of Richard in Black Boy become the realities facing Bigger Thomas and Native Son may provide some clues to the kind of Midwestern influence on Wright's fiction. Making his native son a Midwesterner, Wright saw Chicago as a Midwestern focal point of, and I quote him, the American part of Bigger, which is the heritage of us all. Often thought of in terms of sameness, mostly when I talk to friends from California and so forth. This is when this happened. Midwestern life became identified in Wright's fiction with diversity. I quote here from How Bigger Was Born. Then there was the fabulous city in which Richard lived, a city so young that in thinking of its short history, one's mind as it travels backward in time is stopped abruptly by the barren stretches of a wind-swept prairie. But a city old enough to have caught within the homes of its long, straight streets symbols and images of man's age-old destiny, of truths as old as the mountains and seas, of dreams as abiding as the soul of man itself. city which has become the pivot of the eastern, western, northern, and southern poles of the nation. What comes together in this pivotal point, and what makes Midwestern Chicago the place for the creation of Richard Wright's native son, is the complexity and typicalness resulting for Wright from the convergence of various people and ideologies, climate, and even to some extent geographies from east and west, north and south. Although Wright's characters become, as he was, quote, just a part of the landscape, they also came to know and love, as he did, the distinctiveness of the black experience created in the urban ghetto environment of Chicago. In this way, he encountered south side of Chicago jive talk, the equivalent in many ways of the distinctive black experience and expression he was to remember in Black Boy as the passing down of a culture from one generation to another. I quote from Constance Webb's biography here. To Richard, jive meant fun, play, kidding, hiding things with words, and stepping up the tempo of living through talk. He loved it because it was made up day after day of people on the South Side, made up on a spur of the moment during talk, picked up and tossed from one person to another, enriched, expanded, or thrown away. Careful digesting of the differences between the expectation expressed in Black Boy and the realities facing Bigger Thomas and Native Son caused Wright to identify with and to feel deeply himself a passionate rejection of America, voiced nightly in speeches in Washington Park. Again, Constance Webb records Richard's feelings that these Southern blacks transplanted in the urban Midwest, and I quote, sensed with that directness of which only the simple are capable that they had no chance to live a full human life in America. Their lives were not cluttered with ideas in which they could only half believe. They could not create illusions which made them think that they were living when they were not, and their daily lives were too nakedly harsh to permit of camouflage. Such was the directness, simplicity, and naked harshness that caused Bigger to be born and live where and when he did. The Midwest for Malcolm X was a great many things, most of them negative. The opening chapters of the autobiography with introspective precision, ploddingly methodical. He describes the Midwestern narrowness of Omaha's regard for good niggers as opposed to the followers of Marcus Garvey. Similarly, his experiences in Milwaukee and Michigan produce the nightmare of his early life, where he learns to be a mascot. When he finally does go east, he blames his Midwestern experiences for making him into a hick. I quote, I look like little Abner. Mason, Michigan was written all over me. Thinking only of escape from a narrowness that had restricted his development, he even looks upon the famous encounter with a teacher who advised him to think of carpentry rather than law as a fortunate path out of Midwestern narrowness. I've often thought that if Mr. Ostrowski had encouraged me to be a lawyer, I would today probably be among some city's professional black bourgeoisie. All praise is due Allah that I went to Boston when I did. If I hadn't, I'd probably still be a brainwashed black Christian. But Malcolm often gets at more than what first appears on the surface. This may even be the structure of the autobiography, as many people have commented on. In Boston, he reinterprets his Midwestern background as he confronts a supposed Eastern sophistication. Thus, he may be beginning a counter-movement that might be thought of as a reaffirmation of his Midwestern roots. What I thought I was seeing there in Roxbury were high-class, educated, important Negroes, living well, working in big jobs and positions. I know now, of course, that what I was really seeing was only a big city version of those successful Negro bootblacks and janitors back in Lansing. The only difference was that the ones in Boston had been brainwashed even more thoroughly. They prided themselves on being incomparably more cultured, cultivated, dignified, and better off than their black brethren down in the ghetto. As a working hypothesis, would it be accurate to suggest that Malcolm's counter-rejection of his shame at being a hick might be part of the overall pattern of increasing awareness at the center of the autobiography? A Midwestern base to what has been commented on by critics as the development of Malcolm from being a practical, soulless hustler to becoming a visionary who discovers through the help of an Islamic pastoral norm idealistic tendencies in himself. Malcolm's black Midwestern experience may have been a basis of these tendencies. Perhaps his earliest experiences can be viewed as a foundation of continuity for a life he recognized, and I quote, never has stayed fixed in one position for very long. Lorraine Hainsbury's Raisin in the Sun needs very little summary or elaborate commentary to account for its Midwestern roots. What I would attempt to do is to draw connections between what is obviously Midwestern indebtedness in that play and these other things that I've been talking about. The play is immersed from the beginning in a scene of the life of South Side of Chicago blacks, which is described as a scene of indestructible contradictions and of a weariness that has already won its battle before the play begins. Its characters, from Lena Younger's unfulfilled dreams to Walter's quest for a gimmick, and Bernathea's involvement in what is portrayed as a Midwestern excursion into radicalism, are as much a part of their environment as is Bigger Thomas. Even the land becomes a peculiarly Midwestern symbol, with Clybourne Park and Chicago housing as a dominant motif, Chicago's wide expanse, as well as Walter's lure for Wisconsin, easily accessible by expressways. Wisconsin's lure dangles in front of Walter's opportunistic ambitions. From Mr. Linden's fast talk and Walter's selling out to Ruth Younger's plant, symbol of growth amidst concrete, Raisin in the Sun is embedded in very similar Chicago to the one Richard Wright described as being transplanted in concrete on the western plains. In poetry, there's even a greater range and diversity of Midwestern contributions to the growth of a black aesthetic. There are, for example, the combined Southern and Midwestern motifs of Paul Laurence Dunbar's rural settings. I'd like to mention that next weekend there's a Paul Laurence Dunbar Centennial at the University of Dayton, and I have information on if anybody would like to see the list of people who will be there and the procedures they're going to be going through. Similarly, in the urban Chicago setting, Fenton Johnson expressed shortly after Dunbar what under better conditions might have become the Chicago counterpart to the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s. Following the Depression WPA projects and the rise of little magazines, there emerged in the 40s and 50s many black poets who chose the Midwest as their home, as well as the setting and impetus for their works. Notable among them is Melvin B. Tolson, who was born in Missouri and taught in Oklahoma, Gwendolyn Brooks, who became a foremost teacher of today's young black poets in Chicago and actually started an entire school of the younger black poets there, such as Don L. Lee and Carolyn Rogers. And Gwendolyn Brooks has recently come out with an anthology called Jump Bad, which is a collection of Chicago black poets writing now. Perhaps in a tradition of Midwestern local presses, the 50s and 60s also saw the rise of entirely black-owned and operated Broadside Press in Detroit and Third World Press in Chicago. Besides providing operational and ownership autonomy, Broadside Press has made available tapes of poets reading to correspond to almost every one of their latest books, and broadsides, and these two things stressing the oral dimension and community consciousness preserved throughout the tradition, and some links might be made there with the Midwestern tradition too. Finally, although not a major poet, Herbert Woodward Martin, who teaches at the University of Dayton, who is organizing the conference next week, has recently written a series of poems called the Deadwood Dick Sequence, in which he works the metaphor of the famous black cowboy who is discussed in the book The Negro Cowboys at great length. In Tennessee you hunted rabbits, in Texas you learned men shoot men. Deadwood Dick, yours is a metaphor to exhaust. Drawing upon historical documentation such as that recorded by Durham and Jones, Martin recreates the black Midwestern adventures of Nat Love, James Thomas Crow, dude, singer, actor et al., who went riding west in search of history. In a series of 12 poems, Martin portrays a Midwestern prairie life, primarily through Nat Love's quest for the expanse of the plains, the adventure of new settlement, the freedom of equality in the face of the elements. Further, through the use of a poet persona, he explores the direct and indirect influences of this Midwestern black experiences of Nat Love on Herbert Woodward Martin, Midwestern black poet, 1972. Thank you.